So this week we're going to talk about attachment theory and the way that relationships early in life impact how a person develops their sense of self and how they basically become who they are. To mention a couple of things about attachment first, the word attachment refers to what could be thought of as an inborn system of infants, of all people. When I mean inborn, that means a part of our biological structure, part of our brains, to lead the infant to basically be motivated to borrow the mature functioning of the mature mental and emotional functioning of the adults in their immediate environment, so that they can use that as a working model, the infants, to develop their own mature senses of mental and emotional functioning. The attachment system, which refers to actual parts of the brain and the way they interact, motivates children or every infant to seek out proximity and communication or connection with adults in their environment. That's a really important thing to note, because the attachment theory relates to a set of biological characteristics. That means we're born with those traits as human beings, to seek out that closeness and proximity and connection with other adults, for the good reason of assuming their habits or their presentations to the child, so that the child can actually develop socially and emotionally and mentally. All the information from this PowerPoint that you're hopefully looking at now, it comes from the work of Dan Siegel, who's a psychiatrist who's written a lot on attachment, who developed a model of understanding the developing mind that he calls interpersonal neurobiology, and most of the information from this presentation comes from his book, The Developing Mind. He has another much shorter book called Mindsight, and if you're thinking of becoming a therapist or a social worker, guidance counselor, or if you're thinking of working with young children, or if you just feel like you want to have a better understanding of who you are and how your relationships work, or if you're in lots of other situations, I can see how that would be very fitting for a lot of situations, then I would really strongly recommend you read that book, Mindsight by Dan Siegel. So let's talk first about memory. Memory relates to attachment because attachment relates to experiences in the past. So what is memory? Usually people think of memory as there being something in our brains, in our heads, that we pull out, as it were, and think about or look at or experience again. And that is a good working definition most of the time for practical matters, but it's really not all that accurate. So what memory consists of is basically a higher I'm going to say it first and then explain it, because there's a couple of it's a strange way to put it, but it's pretty precise. What memory is a higher probability that the same or similar neural net profile will be activated. And so let me break that down. Neural refers to neurons, which are the brain cells. That's what those little cells that communicate with one another, that lead to thought and consciousness and feelings and all the rest. By net, we are referring to a web, or like a interconnected whole, woven in and out of one another. And profile is basically a pattern, or like a fingerprint. So a neural net profile is like a thought fingerprint, okay? But it spans across good many parts of the brain typically, and it's where neurons or brain cells are activating and communicating with one another at one time. And the increase in probability just means that there's a higher chance that that same pattern of firing in the brain will happen again in the same or similar way as the more and more it happens. Okay, you can remember the reason that that's the case by the phrase "neurons that fire together wire together." So when two neurons connect or communicate with one another, one fires to the other one, and what basically happens is that there's substance called myelin, which insulates the long tail-like portion of each neuron. And every time the message, which is basically an electrical impulse of ionized chemicals, is put through to the next neuron, that myelin coats the tail-like part of the brain cell. And what that myelin does is makes it more conductive. So it's more likely that electricity, the messages from one cell to another, will pass through it. So they link up basically because there's a higher chance that they'll communicate with one another again. Really briefly, a couple of words that relate to memory theory are engram and ekphory. Basically, engram is the initial experience on the way that an initial experience that becomes a memory maps onto the brain. So if I were to see a painting I've never seen before, that moment that I see it, I'm taking in the light in my eyes, I'm experiencing the bodily sensations as wherever I'm standing there and however I'm feeling. I have thoughts in that moment, whatever those are. That moment of activation in my brain is what's called an engram. That picture, it's like a snapshot of the brain experience. And that leaves the impression on my brain that can later be reactivated as a memory. And it's basically reactivated as an estimation. It's not exactly the same activation each time. That's why we remember things differently, and we don't just pick it out and look at it the same thing. Ekphory refers to the sensation of drawing the memory back to mind, the sensation of remembering, basically. So when as I'm sitting here now, thinking about that time that I first saw that painting, the way it struck me in a way, and I'm remembering that time and bringing it to the conscious, to consciousness, to think about that feeling of remembering is called ekphory. Okay, so there are two types of memory. One that's called implicit memory, and that's what we remember most of. Our body remembers in a certain way, much more than our brain actually remembers, that we remember consciously. And implicit memory has a few particular attributes, 3 attributes of what makes it implicit. The first is that it's conscious, the experience is conscious, but it's not tagged or flagged as a memory. So when we experience it, our brain doesn't register it or encode it as something that we remember later. Another attribute is that we don't have a sensation of recall. In other words, we don't experience ekphory when we think that same memory again. It feels like it's happening in the present. Okay, so another attribute is that it filters our perceptions in daily life. And the reason for that is that it doesn't feel like a memory. It feels like it's happening right now. So if I were to have seen that painting, going back to my example, and I had a sudden sense of anxiety, say I was with my child in the museum and I just noticed the moment I looked at that painting that I didn't know where my child was. I don't know if they were behind me and then they weren't, right? So that emotion of panic would be associated with that picture in my mind. And if I looked at that picture in the future and my implicit memory was very active in that moment with panic, I would feel panic in that moment but not know that, oh, I'm just remembering when I lost my kid in the museum. It would actually be a full experience of present panic then as I look at the picture now. Okay? That's what makes implicit memory so sneaky, is that it basically doesn't feel like a memory. And there are 6 domains that implicit memory impacts. So as I said, it filters our perceptions. That means that if you were to imagine putting on red tinted glasses, the whole world would appear red. All right, so that's similar to what implicit memory does. And it filters our perceptions in 6 ways. It filters our perceptions through our bodily sensations, our bodily awareness. It filters our perceptions through emotion, through the senses like sight and sound. It also filters our behaviors, it filters our mental models, which is something we'll talk about in just a little bit. And it also filters what's called priming. Priming is like activation in the body or in the brain, getting ready to act. So muscular priming would be if you were to just have your hand on your desk or your thigh or something, and you imagined or built the intention up to lift your hand, but didn't quite lift it, but didn't actually activate it, you might actually feel the priming happening. You can imagine yourself lifting it and act as though you're just about to, and there will be sensation in your hand that's similar to that experience. All right, so mental models, they're basically generalized representations of what we experience. The mental model is the brain's good guess based on the evidence that it's experienced throughout previous experiences. A mental model is kind of like a program on a computer in a certain way, so that when this happens, the brain knows just activate this series of responses. Sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not. And the way the implicit memory somewhat impacts development is that as infants we come to learn to predict certain emotional experiences with our caregivers, and we learn that implicitly. As we age, we don't think, oh yeah, I'm having to expect this type of emotion from this person or my parent in this circumstance. We just naturally and implicitly expect it without thinking that it's a memory, even though it is. Okay, so a moment about explicit memory. Explicit memory basically develops around the age of 18 months. It's when a portion of the hippocampus develops or matures. And there are two types. There's a semantic type, which is the factual, the dates and times, that kind of thing. And there's another type that is called episodic memory, and that is the general feeling or impression that a certain memory left. So the painting example, my semantic or factual memory would be that it was painted by Monet, it was at this particular museum, it was raining outside that day, that kind of thing. And the episodic memory would be something like, I felt, well, back to the example of panic, if I did remember that my child was lost, it might be that I have the episodic memory quality of feeling on edge, or maybe the moment before that it felt peaceful, and that was how I remembered it episodically. It's worth noting that with explicit memory, what's considered big T trauma, that means trauma in life that's extremely severe, sexual abuse, physical violence, threats of death, things like that, early in life, where the integrity of one's selfhood is shaken in a certain way, really, really serious bad things, then basically the level of cortisol, which is the stress hormone in the body, elevates to such a degree that the brain basically shuts off the hippocampus. It stops it from encoding any new explicit memory, and it's basically a survival response in the brain, because we instinctively know that we might not be able to handle remembering the experience, basically. So that's why later in life, say in psychotherapy, people might experience a lot of distress in their lives and have to sort of reprocess trauma that they might not have even fully remembered experiencing. Okay, so more directly about attachment theory, a good quote from, it's actually a couple of quotes from the text that I mentioned earlier: children carry those to whom they attached inside of them. So we carry our early relationships with us and apply those early relationships to new relationships. We see the world and see ourselves and see others through our experience of our earliest relationships. It's really important to remember. And it's that fact is based on what's called an internal working model of attachment. So I just mentioned mental models, where they're basically the brain's guess or summary of certain experiences. And the same thing applies in attachment relationships. If I have attachment figures in my early life that leave me with a certain attachment impression, then I'll have a working model of attachment or of relationships, basically, that leads me to predict or expect certain things from others that I see through filtering those experiences through those working models. Okay, so I know that might have been not quite clear, so let me think about another way to put it. So the lens example again. If I put on red tinted glasses, I see the world as red, and if I see others through that lens that was shaped by my early caregiving experiences, then I'll see those people as being equally threatening as I would have my caregivers, or equally as welcoming as I did my caregivers. I'll feel equally as secure as I did when I was with my caregivers, things like that. And it's more likely that you'll see relationships in those same ways. Now, attachment research really began in earnest with what's called the strange situations study. This is when a parent and child, and I think they use all mothers in this case, a mother and child were observed for a year in their home, the first year of life, so this baby was an infant. And then after that first year point, they had them come into a lab and stayed inside a room that was monitored with a stranger to the infant. And over a 20-minute period, the mother left the baby with the stranger, and then in another period, both the mother and the stranger left. And they watched the infant's response when they left, and they watched the infant's response when the mother returned. And that's where the most information was gathered. And based on what they saw, Mary Main, who was heading up the research, basically categorized 4 different ways that the baby responded upon the parent's return. The first is what was considered secure, and there are 2 types that I'll mention in a minute. Avoidant is the next, ambivalent and disorganized or disoriented. The baby's response for secure was you could tell that the baby kind of felt weird at first, maybe cried when the mother left, but then accustomed to it a little bit and maybe a little uneasy, but was okay, went back to playing with toys or whatever was there. When the mother returned, the baby was happy to see her, ran and made contact with her in some way, stayed there for a moment, and then basically felt settled enough to be independent in the room again. Avoidant attachment, children who were considered in that category of avoidant attachment basically showed no emotion when the mother left and no emotion when the mother returned, or they would actively avoid the mother when they returned. So if the mother picked them up, they would hold their hand up and turn away from the mother. And those babies were very particularly concerned with the toys or objects in the room as opposed to the people in the room. The ambivalent category of attachment, infants were very seldomly soothed even before the mother left. They're very emotionally labile, which means they were kind of all over the place emotionally. When the mother left, they were unconsolable while they were gone. Didn't focus on the toys at all or anything, just sat and cried. And when the mother returned, they immediately went for them, clung to them, and also pulled away from them. And that was an interesting feature. So they clung to them maybe with hands, but kind of fought the parent also, and were just unconsolable throughout most of the rest of the experiment. They never really were able to soothe back down to playing with toys again. With disorganized or disoriented, this is an attachment category that's associated with the most amount of high trauma or very difficult or distressing trauma. And these infants basically had very, well, based on the title of the category, they were somewhat disoriented. They didn't really focus on the toys, they didn't really focus on the mother. There was a lot of instances of kind of freezing, like when the mother returned, there's a kind of frozenness there. And it's that type of response tended to happen because with disorganized or disoriented attachment, The baby sees the parent as the source of threat and instinctively sees the parent as the source of soothing. So it's a paradox. They need soothing from the parent, but the parent's the one they need soothing from. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And so those are the four basic categories of attachment that's been set down. Now, with secure, there's continuous, which means basically from day one throughout the relationship fostered that secure attachment. Prospectively earned refers to when a child might develop a relationship with another attachment figure, or things change in their attachment figure's relationship with them, so that they eventually do end up basically with secure features of attachment. The reflective function is something I put in here because it's a really strong trait of what secure attachment, securely attached infants and adults seem to demonstrate. The reflective function basically refers to the ability to perceive and understand one's own mind and perceive and understand others' minds. That's also considered what's called a theory of mind, the ability to kind of guess what others are thinking and feeling. And that's higher in those who are securely attached and lower in those who are insecurely attached, the other types of, the other categories of attachment. Okay, I'm going to try to keep going a little bit faster. I'm already at 21 minutes, so I'm going to try to push ahead. So constraints, I'll not go too deeply into this, but basically there are exterior constraints and interior constraints. And I've put a couple of dates or time frames about when these exactly come about in an infant's life. But in terms of what it refers to with attachment, interior, the avoidant attachment style has an overemphasis or over-reliance on on interior constraints. So when they grow up, they tend to be dismissive of others and rely more on themselves. And the interior and the exterior constraint is typically more relied upon by those with ambivalent attachment. That means there's a smaller reliance on a sense of self and more reliance on somewhat neediness in relationships. So I'll kind of leave that there. The primary intersubjectivity, caregiving representation, and secondary intersubjectivity are all kind of like stages in the early infant period where there's an established relationship with an external or exterior constraint, the parent, and then the representation begins in the child's mind about that parent. That's the internal constraint and interior constraint. And the secondary intersubjectivity is when those two things blend or relate with one another. So the relation of those two things, the interior and exterior constraints, and basically what results is the attachment style, leads to a more or less weakened or strengthened sense of self in the infant. And when we say the state of mind with regard to attachment, that basically means how we develop based on our early relationships and attachments. Okay, so I've listed a few ways that you might think of what it means to have a sense of self, something that we don't always really think about, but we assume I'm me, and there's no more explanation needed. But it's important to recognize that we know ourselves at many different layers, and one of them could be thought of as our bodily layer. This is me, this figure that I inhabit is me, this body. Another is what's called the perspectival sense of self. That means I'm the center of all I see and hear and feel and sense in my environment. Subjective sense of self could be thought of as the thinking me inside my head, the feeling me in my emotions, and so on. The narrative sense of self relates more specifically in timeline to attachment. There's these events define me in my life, and they've built up in such a way, so here I am now. That's kind of the way we know ourselves narratively. And there's a couple other ways you can think about. But those are important to remember because attachment doesn't point to one sense of self. It points to the way that early relationships influence all of those senses of ourselves. So, how do relationships specifically impact attachment? So, I'm going to read this quote on this slide. Caregivers are the architects of the way in which experience influences the unfolding of genetically pre-programmed but experience-dependent brain development. And human connections create neural connections. So the word experience here doesn't mean particular experiences. It means all that we experience, all that we see and hear and feel and think. Caregivers, attachment figures, parents, whatever you want to call them, can be thought of as architects of how the infant's genetic dispositions, the way the genes are inherently built, the parents are the architects of how those genes come to express themselves, how they unfold, basically, how they turn into who the child will become. And it's the second bullet point on this points to the fact that overproduction of neurons, an infant has a vast number more of brain cells than it needs or that we have. And there's a natural process of what's called pruning, where a lot of those brain cells die. And that's really important because the brain becomes more specialized in doing certain human-based tasks and relationships. And that process of overproducing neurons is genetically driven. That happens no matter what occurs in your life. But the way that the brain is pruned, the way that the brain cells are pruned away, is dependent on the environment or on your relationships. So what parts of your brain becomes specialized in social connection, for instance, can also basically be pruned away if it's not stimulated in early growth. Okay? So it's a really, tall responsibility for caregivers to be able to provide the environment for the child in such a way that the pruning process occurs effectively, so that the child has the brain structures that they need at the end of the first year and then beyond that. It's a useful and hopeful piece of information that has only recently been discovered is what's called epigenetics. And that refers to the fact that although our genes are programmed and we can't change our genes or our genetic structure, our environment and our early experiences this is the key part, and our experiences throughout life actually influence how those genes express themselves. And it's pretty phenomenal because that means we're not locked into what we inherit genetically. We start there and we can't change those things, but it's basically like our genes give us the ingredients and our experience organizes them in a certain recipe to become who we are. And that process doesn't change, doesn't stop throughout life. Although the early part of life is really, really essential in setting that up. Rupture and repair really just point to the fact that in early relationships, there are times, throughout relationships, but there are times when the relationship could be thought of as being under high tension or under high duress or almost feeling broken, and I mean between the caregiver and the child. And there are times when that might happen to all dyads, groups of two people, a parent and child. But repair, the act of the parent coming back to the child, reconnecting with the child, displaying an openness and affection and care for the child that's consistent with who they are to the child, is a really essential for the child's coming to expect predictable emotional experience from their caregiver. So, in summation, I've thrown a lot of information at you, and I know that attachment theory is a bigger field than I could sum up in a 9-slide PowerPoint in half an hour. But I hope that there are some essentials there that you can kind of hang on to. But I want to end this by pointing to one quote again from the text that I referred to. Attachment research suggests a direction for how relationships can foster healthy brain function and growth. through contingent collaborative communication that involves sensitivity to signals, reflection on the importance of mental states, and the nonverbal attunement of states of mind. And I've picked out 4 essential parts of that, and this relates to your reading that you did. Sensitivity to signals means we can watch even an infant or young children and tell or can read their signals that they give us verbally and non-verbally, and we can read them coherently and kind of understand what they're pointing to emotionally. Nonverbal attunement is how we relate or respond non-verbally to those signals that we read from them. So opening up, facial expression, carrying gestures with hands, smiles, eye contact, and so on. The third point is reflection of mental states, which is something like, in a verbal sense, maybe with an older child saying, you seem to feel really upset right now. You seem to feel really hurt. You seem to feel really excited. We're trying to mind read the emotional state of the child, and they can, even infants in some ways or another, kind of respond to your reflection. Okay, so you reflect by responding in a certain way that would fit their being upset or fit their being happy. And you can tell they'll let you know in some way or another that you've gotten it right. The last point, contingent communication. I put this at the bottom because I think that the first 3 things lead to your ability to contingently communicate. That means you respond openly based on your sensitivity to signals, the nonverbals that you give and receive, and the mental states that you're basically guessing in the child. Okay, so you're using your empathy and your ability to empathize and your ability to observe the child to base what you say, how you respond, how you sound, how you act toward that child on all of that information, all of that emotional information. Okay, so like I said, I did my best to cover a big, wide field in a pretty short amount of time, even though this probably might not have felt like a really short amount of time. But hopefully it's clear enough to hit some of the highlights of a really important field for you if you're going to be working in any capacity with children, but also if you're going to be working with adolescents or adults in ways that overlap with emotional development and service in that kind of way. Okay, so that's it for this week. Just keep an updated eye on Blackboard for assignments and things like that. And as always, reach out to me if you have any questions about it.